Good afternoon, buenos dias, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Ayşegül Savaş and Brandon Taylor to discuss White on White, a novel, published by our friends at Riverhead Books. Ayşegül Savaş is the author of Walking on the Ceiling. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, the Paris Review, Granta, and elsewhere. She lives in Paris. To moderate today's conversation, we are also joined by Brandon Taylor, who is the author of Filthy Animals, a national bestseller, and Real Life, which has shortlisted for the Booker Prize, longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, and named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of White on White from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Thank you for that introduction.
Exciting. I'm so thrilled to be here with you to celebrate this wonderful and beautiful new book. Thrilling to have it out in the world. How does it feel to be sharing it with us?
It's slightly anxious, but I'm just relieved that you're doing something in your head for such a long time, and there's so many ways to read what you're trying to do, and then you think, okay, I'm done. I'm done giving it form and let others, make meaning.
Oh yeah. Well, I will say that I got to read an early copy of it, and I read it at this time when I was working on my own novel about art, and this book completely incapacitated me for weeks. I was like, why even bother? She's done it. She's written the book that I want to read about art and being an artist, and I just had to lie on my couch and feel depressed about my own prospects for many weeks. But this book haunted me long after reading. It stayed with me. I still think about Agnes and her beautiful apartment that she shares with the narrator. I mean, it's just a glorious novel. I'm excited to get to talk to you about it. Could you start us off with a reading so we can have a sense of the world of the book?
I would love to. So the book is about a narrator who moves to an unnamed city for a year to do research on Gothic nudes, or nudes in Gothic sculpture. Rents an apartment from a painter named Agnes, and Agnes tells the narrator that she'll be coming from time to time to use the upstairs studio. Agnes arrives shortly into the book and doesn't leave, and it becomes clear that something is quite wrong. And I guess the book is in some ways a portrait of Agnes's unraveling. So here's a bit from Agnes's past. Whenever she was visiting home, Agnes's daughter said that she wanted the two of them to cook together. The deliberation of it struck Agnes as odd. It was obvious that they would cook. How could they not? But the statement made it forced, if not artificial. Her daughter suggested lengthy recipes that carried an idea of old times. Jams, pies, roasted meats. She took photographs as they cooked. Once or twice, Agnes had come across these photographs on her daughter's social media pages with a line or two about the mother-daughter bond. She didn't know how to point out the insincerity to her daughter, who was part of a generation of educated women that paid rapt attention to the things that gave them pleasure and turned them into rituals for display. That's a crude way to say it, she added. I don't want to sound embittered. These women, she went on, were indignant about any criticism regarding their exquisitely curated lives. Her daughter, for one, would defend the luxuries of her life as necessary ways of caring for herself. Taking a bath, buying a dress, going out to a restaurant were all considered therapies for the soul and its small wounds. The simplest acts, Agnes thought, The very fabric of life had spun out of proportion, expanded to grotesque magnitudes of egocentricity, just like old paintings restored with too bright colors that lost the subtleties of their initial expressions. She brought a hand to her earlobe and tugged on the drooping pearl. Still, she told me, she'd never share these thoughts with her daughter out of fear of alienating and upsetting her. Her daughter would probably say that Agnes was trying to silence her, as so many women and their needs were silenced. This was a point her daughter brought up often. It made her uncomfortable, Agnes said, because she was almost certain that her children knew very little of what it meant to be truly voiceless. Her daughter might also point out that it was healthy to talk about oneself, to look deep within in order to untangle the traumas she'd carried since childhood. If Agnes were to tell her daughter that she had grown up with no real traumas, she would probably be told that her own point of view was informed by a lack of introspection, by everything Agnes had silenced within herself. There was no arguing with her daughter, she told me, because disagreements could only ever point to Agnes's own blindness. She paused and looked at me. I could tell she was waiting for me to agree with her, as I often did, to tell her she was neither blind nor mistaken. But I didn't feel it in myself to say it. Sometimes, Agnes continued, she had the sense that her daughter did not quite consider her own mother a real woman. And despite her daughter's insistence that women should love and honor themselves with all their flaws, the type of woman she must have had in mind was pleasingly vulnerable, easy to console and embrace, whereas Agnes was rigid and cold. The room brightened dramatically with a parting cloud. Agnes turned her face towards the window and closed her eyes. I keep talking and talking, she said, her eyes still closed. I talk, and I don't know what you're thinking. I'll stop here.
Oh, I could just listen to you read that forever. I mean, it's just I'm so glad you read that passage because it speaks to so many of like the book's preoccupations, like the sort of subtle shifting complexities of like every relationship, like the power dynamics that are playing out within every relationship, but also like the way that telling a story about your relationship with another person is a way of like seizing power that you maybe don't feel in the moment. And it's just like very hypnotic the way that Agnes is just like telling this story to the narrator in this apartment. So I guess my first question is, this novel is so delicately and complexly layered and stitched together so finely. I wonder, like, where did the story begin for you? Like, what was the first sort of little spark that gave you this story? Because there are so many, like, almost like iconic images and objects and moments in the book that I found myself like unable to figure out, like, okay, this was the first this is where it began, like this is where the story began. Like there's so many little moments in the book that I couldn't even figure out like where or how this story had come to you or come together. So I'd love to you talk a little bit about the origins of the story of the novel.
So the very first image, but as an author, you know that, when we point to like the origin of anything, it's totally false. But now, the origin story of this book is that I had in mind an empty room or an empty apartment, white walls, no furniture, open windows, and just curtains and curtains streaming or sort of floating with wind streaming in. And I thought, I want to populate this place, and I want to sort of add layers to the whiteness of this home and find out what it is. And then the other sort of competing impulse was to write a ghost story.
Mm-hmm.
And but then I thought, I don't think it's quite in me to write, a ghost story in that way, but I'll try to do it in my own way. So maybe I'll use sort of the genre or the atmosphere of a ghost story, but use that to investigate what interests me, which is often people's stories and the way that people tell stories. And then it was sort of a matter of figuring out who Agnes was and how she was going to be in relationship with the material of the book, with this apartment, with the ghostly feeling.
Mhm.
And actually I first figured that out in the last chapter of the book, and I thought, this is how Agnes talks, and this is how she relates to the world. She has this relentless speech that's pouring out of her, and she can't stop herself, and she's so troubled by everything that she has to say. So then these three things, I think, made up the book.
Oh, amazing. I love that. And did you always know that there would be this almost like spectral narrator who's like drifting through, Agnes's life? She's got her own stuff to deal with. She's working on this project regarding nudes. And then there's Agnes, who is like this I consider her like very present, sort of almost overpowering, overflowing presence in the book. And so I found it very fascinating that the narrator is so spectral almost, and then Agnes is so powerful. So did you always know that there would be a narrator who would be, sort of trying to navigate around these like moments of Agnes's like speechifying about her life?
I knew, not to this extent. In the final draft, the narrator almost does nothing and just observes. And I did realize that could be quite a creepy element. But I did know from the beginning that I wanted a frame narrator, just because to me that's an easier way to tell a story. It's sort of like in Somerset Maugham's novels. Somerset Maugham is telling the story. I didn't see them until 3 months later when I ran into them at on the left bank or whatever, right? So I thought I would have the narrator sort of facilitate the telling of a story, because then I could have Agnes speaking, and I could just play around with Agnes's narrative as much as I wanted. But then it was a matter of balancing. At one version, in one draft of the book, I had the narrator, have friends, go back to their university town, all of these things, and I thought, it doesn't matter. I don't need to give everyone a backstory just because, fiction dictates it.
Yeah. Was there a temptation in those drafts where the narrator was, sort of going around and bumping up against other people outside of Agnes? Was there a temptation to sort of like lean into that fully? And then how did you decide that no, you wanted her to be that sort of restrained, piercing, observational intelligence that was seeing everybody's motives in the story?
I think a few things. Both my agent Sarah said I'm really interested in Agnes, and I'm not that interested in what's happening with the narrator. A few other people pointed this out, and then I thought, okay, let me get rid of this. And almost in the way those those Carver stories were edited, right? That you have so much material, and once you begin taking things out, it creates new meaning. Not that meaning was there in the first draft, or in whatever draft, but that once you begin to remove, you sort of like begin to pay attention to like what sort of story that emptiness can create. So I just thought this is actually quite fun. I intended to write a ghost story. I don't know if I achieved it in the first drafts, but now that I'm cutting, I can feel the ghostliness come in, just because the reader doesn't know why the narrator continues to be quiet, or like why Agnes just talks and talks, and we have to sort of read the silences in between, and the presence in between.
Yeah. And I love what you say about the almost redactions, the way that creates these little pockets of meaning for the reader to project onto, because I think there's a line in the book that's like, I think it's like Agnes describing her work, where she's like, inside of every silence was like a finer silence, and the more she became attuned to it, that sort of thing. And I feel like when you it's so funny that there were these like moments that you took out of the book, because you're right, like suddenly it forces the story, it opens up all these possible connections between what's left. and suddenly you're sort of shaping the narrative by shaping the gaps that you've created by taking out stuff. And I just find that like also so deeply analogous to Agnes's like artistic project.
Yes, and well, I think, I don't know if you would agree, but this is sort of the case with every writing, even if you're not creating a work that is so sparse or that has so much unsaid, but still, you know, you put a lot of material and then you have to let the material speak and say, okay, well, I had my own vision of what it was, and the writing is telling me, no, this is, you know, this is who I am and this is what I am, and then you let it come to life. But at the same time, Agnes is, I mean, she's both trying to understand the silence. She also cannot stop talking. And it's almost a reversal that like her speech is filling all of the crevices of the book.
Yeah. I love those moments when Agnes gets like very annoyed with the narrator. She's like, I can't read your mind. Tell me how you feel. Like those moments where she's almost like, tell me how you feel about what I have said so that I can understand if I'm a good person or not. And the narrator is just like, why do you need that? You know, the narrator is just completely blank to her. And so there are these moments where Agnes is kind of searching so desperately for some reflection of the story she's telling so that she can figure out like what it means about her and like what her life means to her. And she's so dependent on, you know, the people who have done that work for her for so long of like reflecting back to her that she suddenly is confronted with the silence of her own company in a way, and she does not handle it well, I feel.
No, and I mean, I did want to play with this idea of compassion, you know, offering compassion to someone by saying, I hear you, especially when you see them suffering. But also, the narrator's silence isn't too much different than what Agnes's own erasure, active erasure in the past, right? That Agnes has sort of turned away from her parents, her social class, her family, and created something on a blank canvas. And she's also, you know, erased so many people from her life for this reason. And now she's upset with the narrator for, you know, for not reaching out.
That's just like so endlessly compelling to me. Like this person who has done, I mean, her whole life is like, you're totally right, like a project of redaction and erasure. It's like how she makes her art, it's how she lives, it's how she manages all of her relationships. And yet when she's confronted with it in a way that she can't control or seize agency over, she just has no coping strategy, because you can't erase something that's already redacted. Like she can't deal with it. And I find that so endlessly compelling. So we've sort of alluded to this here or there. And it's like one of the big preoccupations of the book is also art. Both the narrator's sort of thesis project of like doing this sort of work regarding nudity, which is, I think, another kind of like redaction of clothing and vulnerability and exposing yourself. So there's the narrator's preoccupation with art, and then Agnes's artistic practice. And the book is full of these incredibly rich, almost sensuous meditations on art, both its meaning, its context, its process, its generation, its the fate of art in the world today. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about both art as a subject and also finding a way to turn that into narrative, because I find it's such a difficult thing to tread, because you don't want to turn into like writing an essay on art in the middle of a novel, but like also writing an essay about art in the middle of a novel is like really fun. So how do you turn art into narrative?
This was my constant fear when I was writing, like, wait, am I writing an essay now? Because also, you know, to have a narrator who is an art historian, and to have that sound plausible, the narrator's research sound plausible, but not too technical. And to have Agnes be a painter and her painting to be real enough, but not cliched, you know, like the way one would imagine a painter in writing or in a book, but also to not bore the reader. This was something I did struggle with. And then I thought, since I'm not a medievalist myself, I thought I'm going to keep parts of the narrator's research that are truly interesting to me as a non-academic. The way that was one of the big moments when the book made sense to me was when I knew what the narrator's research would be. And I asked early on, I actually just told this to Katie Kitamura, that early on the narrator's research topic was mourning. And I thought, I can't do that because Katie has done it. And I started looking for other subjects.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. Give me one moment. Part of living in the city, packages every day. So I love that the narrator does have this research interest, and I love that's sort of ingenious that you sort of turned your expertise in medievalism into like a gauge of like what's interesting to a non-expert. I had never in my life even conceived of such a thing.
But the topic was given to me by a medievalist friend, and because I didn't know what topics would be available to a student who was writing their PhD thesis. And my friend Carl said, well, this is a topic I wanted to write about when I was a student. And it's a really interesting topic. It still hasn't been covered, this nudes in Gothic sculpture, and of which there are very few, but they're all very meaningful. And he sent me what I remember as an epic email, and he said, well, and here are some texts that you could read, and these are general findings on the iconography of the soul. And I thought, oh my God, like that is the topic, the iconography of the soul. And I remember shouting to my husband, we have a topic. And then just that frame, then, I thought, okay, what of Agnes's monologues do I keep in relationship to the idea of nudity or the idea of being completely unraveled without any layers of, identity or self-presentation?
Oh, wow. So was the topic a late breaking addition to the novel writing process? Was the narrator's research idea like sort of a late inclusion that brought it all together for you?
Well, late-ish, just because in my mind, all of writing is early mess, early mess, early mess, early mess. And then there's this, like, to me, one day of, late epiphanies or, things falling into place. But actually, that's probably a year or two.
So relatable. I feel so much mess. There's so much mess. So I guess still on the topic of art, this book reads so swiftly, and part of that is because it feels so compelling. I found myself wanting to know, like, what are the narrator's thoughts? Like, I must know, like, what she thinks about this thing that she's dug up in this church, and like what are her thoughts on the statuary and on Agnes's work, and like what are Agnes's thoughts on the narrator's research. I love novels that give a character like a rich inner life, but also an intelligence where it feels like you're engaging with like a mind that has thoughts about things. But it's so outside of the scope of what we consider quote unquote traditional plot. Like in some sense, the plot of this novel is like people having ideas and talking about them. I'd love to talk a little bit about that. Like, was there ever a moment when you were like, is this going to be interesting to anyone else? Like, because I know a lot of writers have a lot of anxiety about writing about, writers or artists or things like that, because they're like, will a reader care about this? And I cared very much about the narrator's thoughts and her consciousness and her ideas. But I know that as a writer, sometimes you're trying to like play 3D chess with the reader's expectations.
Yep. I mean, Brandon, this is not kidding. Every single day, I think, is what I'm writing interesting. How can I write plots? Like, how can I just write a story in which things happen? And then even when I do write things that to me are huge events, I'll hear people say like, "Oh, it's such a quiet story. Nothing much happens, but there are lots of thoughts in here." So I think part of it is coming to terms with the fact that that isn't my style. And I do have to pursue what's interesting to me. And part of it is also trying to get rid of ideas of what a book has to be, right? And I think a lot of those ideas are very narrow. They're based on contemporary English language books, and a very small portion of those books too. And there's so much literature. Fragmented literature was happening like thousands of years ago. I won't exaggerate, but 4,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So just sort of being open to that and knowing that I don't have to, just because that is the popular mode of writing today, I don't have to try and mimic it because I will definitely fail. But also trying to find, understand what my voice is and how to make that stronger and more accessible to the reader. I'm not trying to write books that are like have no plot and then they bore you to death. But how can I communicate what interests me truly to my own reader?
Yeah, I mean, I was totally riveted. I was like, wow, this is everything I want. People having thoughts about art, sign me up. I must know everything. And another one of the book's real strengths, and we talked a little bit about this in the green room, is mood and atmosphere and tone. And I feel like this book conjures such a specific mood and vibe and energy that like even though you weren't describing a lot of things, I felt like I could picture Agnes's apartment so vividly. And everywhere the narrator went, I felt like I was like there with her, like feeling these kind of like bleak, but then like very beautiful days. And the way that you describe, even in that passage you read, where you describe the room becoming suddenly brighter when the sun shifts, like these like subtle little details conjure such a specific atmosphere and mood. And in some sense, I feel like your book is like a perfect example of mood as plot, like mood, like shifting moods and atmosphere as like a plot engine driving the book. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about like conjuring mood and using mood and like how mood is functioning in the novel.
I mean, I'm so happy that you say that, just because it's my favorite thing to write. Landscape or atmosphere or mood, all of these things, to me, partly determine the subject of a book. And that probably is what I would call voice in fiction, is the mood of the world that's being created, which is always also hand in hand with the content of it, right? That I didn't want to create this somewhat eerie gothic mood in the book and then have Agnes's stories be completely detached, but this idea of concealment and a concern with aesthetic to echo the other themes of the book. And also I thought, well, since Agnes is a painter, I do want the writing of the book to have a painterly quality, to pay attention to light, to pay attention to colors, to pay attention to objects, all the things that a painter would pay attention to. Because one of the ideas that I investigate is this ability to understand another person's consciousness and what it means to inhabit really the texture of someone else's consciousness. And then there is something else about the art and the mood, the way that it's so held back. It's very descriptive, and it does pay a lot of attention to what is beautiful. And and to these settings and to these artworks as if those were universally beautiful, right? As if those were sort of the facts of the novel. Whereas I think Agnes, and we see Agnes perfectly put together, the narrator paying great attention to Agnes's appearance, which then in the course of the book begins to fall apart. And this idea that, you know, this aesthetic that's been so carefully put together is in fact so fragile. And it's been so informed by ignoring other parts of Agnes's identity that there's no way that at the moment of crisis, which is, you know, what I guess triggers the book into existence, there's no way that this aesthetic and this, you know, restrained style can really keep together.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, the work of a moment, and I feel like in some parts, like Agnes's the narrator's perception of Agnes is a collaboration between the two of them. It's both Agnes and the narrator, and
Yes.
Agnes performing for the narrator, and the narrator like having thoughts about Agnes's performance for her sake. Like it's this complicated set of two-way projections that's happening between them at all times. And you're right, like when it gets put under pressure, like the social reality of it just like completely just like, you know, unravels the minute it has to sustain any real scrutiny.
Oh, I love this idea of a collaboration between Agnes and the narrator to keep, you know, Agnes's identity intact.
Yeah, I mean, and in some sense, like the Agnes who emerges from that collaboration can only exist in those kitchens at those tables as they're sort of talking back and forth. It can only exist in those sort of moments where they're together, because then of course we find out about like Agnes with her family is quite different from Agnes with the narrator.
Yes. And I mean, Agnes's unraveling, I think Agnes with her family has, even as Agnes is coming undone to the narrator, is still keeping up appearances for her family, just because I think that's been sort of the contract between them, that my children will never be burdened by my family. They will never have to visit my parents. My husband will never be burdened by my past or by my opinions, but we will all, you know, live this beautiful family life and all go see art together.
Yeah, it's so I find that so juicy. Like it's so rich and complicated, and I love mess, and Agnes is like so messy. Her life is it's a beautiful mess, curated to within an inch of its existence, but like so messy and complicated. Um I guess my next question is just about the way that you dramatize conversation and disclosure. So like a lot of the novels, like dramatic action is like Agnes telling stories about herself to the narrator, and it's dramatized, and I feel like I love what you said earlier about there being a frame narrator, because in some sense, like the novel is composed in frame narrations, like frame stories. Like Agnes is always telling the narrator all these stories about herself, and each story has its own characters. And so it's like this all these lovely nested stories. And so I'd love you to talk a little bit about like that formal play, Agnes as narrator of her own stories about her life, and the I guess like also the complications of that, of trying to tell a story in stories.
Yes. You know, when I realized that the structure of the book would be a series of basically monologues by Agnes, I also thought that these narratives are items of clothing that Agnes is putting on, and there is a lot of attention paid to what Agnes wears in the book. And I thought these narratives are ways in which Agnes tries to conceal herself, or to cover her nudity. So I did know that each narrative would be about her manipulation
Mm.
of the truth, or the way that she wants to come across to someone else. And then, this is much easier to do if there is a frame narrator, if we have an audience to whom you can manipulate your own identity, right? And you're given the chance to speak. And then I guess I'm also interested in the way that, I'm not quite sure how to say it. Well, I guess given the chance to create a self-portrait, to talk at length about yourself, what is the moment in which your narrative is going to get tangled up? And it really has to, you really have to break it down in order to free yourself. And, narrative and as something opposed to madness, right? That madness maybe is a lack of narrative, and it's also a lack of clothing. And Agnes's messiness coinciding with the moments when she's able to be most truthful. And then, well, the big sort of technical problem with having a character speak, continuously for the length of the novel is then how do I keep my reader's interest? And also knowing, sort of from personal experience, that people don't sit down and tell you autobiographies. They don't say, I was born in 1985 in Istanbul. My mother's name is this and my father's name is that, right? People are very messy in the way that they present themselves. So how do I reflect a sense of this mess and the sense of how someone's brain works, but also give a sense of a whole life? And order things in such a way that the reader can begin to make sense of Agnes's past without having this like very linear account, which to me isn't very believable.
Yeah, I mean, it's the I think of that as like the Russian novel problem, because in a Russian novel, it very much would have been Agnes first sits down, she tells her the first 20 years of her life, then they sit down and she tells her the next 10 years, and then like the sort of like linearity of like the Russian novel versus a more sort of amorphous, coherent incoherence in a way. And I feel like in the novel, you're totally right. Like we get bits, we get pictures, we get images, and then we have to put them together. And it's the putting together that sort of gives the book its form ultimately. I love it. I mean, I could talk to you forever, but we're going to do audience questions. Send in your questions using the Ask a Question box. We've got a few already. So this one is from Jess. Can you speak more on atmosphere as plot, on small plot, to use your words, where nothing much happens? How do you see this impacting the kind of stories you tell, the characters and concepts that interest you?
Well, I never think, when I'm interested to write about something, I never think like this is a plotless subject and therefore I should write about it. I'm often just interested in, something I hear or something I remember and I want to investigate. I think the way in which I end up writing those stories are more about the psychological states than they are about what actually happened. If, let's say, someone got into a car accident and the repercussions of this was that, they had to sell their house and then they moved to a different place and everything went wrong. In this story, I'm much more interested not in these big events, but in sort of the small moments that inform someone's existence. And that's also how I think of my own life, as present moments that in which I have a sense of the greater picture, or my place and my society's place around me. So I think that's just how I approach whatever big event interests me, by focusing on the psychological state.
Mm. I love that. I did an interview with Katie Kinemura, and she said something similar where she was like, I like to use psychology, but to borrow the sort of scaffolding of thriller writing. So like these psychological states, but like written as thrillers. And I'm like, yes, that is absolutely what a separation is.
Absolutely. And the same with intimacies. And I think I do feel so close. I mean, I love her writing so much. And for this reason, that it feels that the stakes are so high and her books are so thrilling to read. And yet, it's not like there's a car chase or a robbery or something, but the stakes are existentially very high for me.
Mm-hmm. And I felt that in this book as well. It was so charged. Like it meant, and I think that's what happens when a writer pays attention to what matters to their characters. And when they hone in on those like very particular psychological states, that's really, I think, where the good stuff is, so to speak. So this is from Emily. Was this book influenced in any way from your short story Canvas? If so, are the questions you're asking in the story versus the novel different? In what ways?
It definitely was. So Canvas ended up being the final chapter of the book. And I wrote it, I was working on White on White when I wrote Canvas, but that was the first longish monologue of Agnes's that I wrote. And when I was done, I thought, okay, this is going to be the texture of the rest of the book. And I'm going to have Agnes tell these types of sort of longer stories. But then as a last chapter, it has to be doing a lot more work, and it has to sort of be echoing the greater themes. The beginning of the book is a lot more removed than the beginning of a short story. So there is, it's different. I won't say what happens in the end, and also, there's this idea that short stories can end on a moment of silent realization, whereas a novel, I think, does have to end on a moment where the time of the novel feels true, that we have spent all of this time with a character, and now we're feeling the weight of our sojourn with them.
Oh, that's fascinating. I hadn't thought about that. Wow, that is such an important point about a novel needing to, in some way, bear the weight of everything that's come before.
Brandon,
Wow.
how do you distinguish between the two? Because you write both.
Oh, I mean, I feel like for me, my approach to endings is, I think, always the same, in that I want it to feel like a light has flashed back through the whole length of the story to sort of highlight and reveal and shift things forever. And to me, like, I want an ending that deepens the concerns of the whole story in some way. And that's also how I approach novels and stories, is that I just want there to feel like a light has been beamed back through the whole story, and now you have this like revelation or sense of revelation. But I think, of course, there's always the fine-tuning phase where you want an ending to feel right. And I feel like a part of my calculus is definitely are we paying off the long time we've hung out with this character? I think that's definitely a part of the calculation. And I hadn't realized that until you just said that. That's, yeah. It's really important, I think, that an ending feel like it's in accord with the story and its scope and form. Here we go. This is from Aisha. Did you feel any pressure, internal or external, to make this novel? Oh, I lost the question. To make this novel similar to or different from your previous novel?
It wasn't so much pressure, more than it was just being so sick of what I'd done in the previous novel and thinking I never want to do that ever again. Like, exhausting. I don't know, Brandon, have you had this feeling before? That, like, my first novel was, it was told in fragments. It was a lot about walking in a city. It was about, flashbacks of the narrator. And with this book, I thought, I am done with public spaces. I'm done with Paris and Istanbul for the foreseeable future, and I am done with remembering parts. Although this isn't true for Agnes, but at least she isn't just remembering; she's telling her story and, crafting her own narrative. So it was definitely a reaction to my first book, and just wanting to do something different and something where I wouldn't be bored of my own thoughts and of my own style.
Oh yeah, I feel you big. I feel you so big. Same. I mean, working on my next book, I'm just like, students, here we go again. Another book with people trying to figure out how to be an artist. Why am I doing this? Should this be a book? Should I just throw this away? What journey am I on? And so I find myself having to have these long conversations, like justifying my continuing preoccupation with my preoccupations. And I think something that you said earlier was really soothing to me, which is that you just got to follow your interests. You just got to let it be what it will be and accept yourself.
Yes. And I do have to say, I mean, stylistically and sort of in terms of landscape, I get bored. But then I really write the same story again and again and again. I mean, everything I've written, I think, in my life is about people unable to offer one another empathy and compassion and the struggle to connect with another person.
We are writing the same story. We are just telling the same stories over and over. I love that for us. Yes. Oh, yeah. What a harrowing thing to find yourself repeating and then to figure out, should I just keep doing it? Should I just keep going? This one is from Books and Books. Do you have a specific writing process?
Well, should I take it all away? The specific writing process is very messy. I mean, I try to, if I'm not teaching, I try to read. I try to read almost every day, even if I'm teaching for 4 hours. And then I think of this as sort of the groundwork for any writing. And if I'm not writing, but I have read for 4 hours that day, I think, okay, well, I've done the writing in some form. And then the more technical aspects of writing is if I have just started something, there is really no routine. It's just like, please, someone help me. And, I'll sit down for an hour and I'll try to write something. I try to keep to 500 words a day. And I think that's sort of my magic number. It's not too long. It's not too short. It adds up to a novel at some point. And then after about, a year or two of this, I think, okay, I can do this. And then it's sort of, you can do it all day, every day when you're editing.
Yeah, I love editing for that reason, because it feels like you punch in, you work your pages, you clock out, you clock in the next day. I love editing because it's just,
and you can make the manuscript nicer. When it's just an early draft, like, who cares if you add some nice bits, because maybe they're not going to be in conversation with the rest of the book. Maybe you're going to cut them out. It's almost like wearing your nicest sweater on top of sweatpants, like, it's not worth the nice sweater.
Yeah. Oh, love editing. It's the best part because it just feels so good. This is from Mary. Does your writing connect to your work as a photographer?
Very nice question. Yes, I think so. Although it's very difficult to come with like a very specific, yes, I take a photograph of someone on the street and that becomes a character. It's not like that. But I am aware that I'm very visual, and that, this probably partly has to do with my love of writing atmosphere and landscape, and my interest in photography. I think these two things probably go hand in hand. And probably the reason I ended up writing a book about a painter is because I'm so drawn to the visual and what that communicates, what that conceals, how an instant that we see can hold so many stories and can also conceal so many stories.
Yeah. Oh, I recently took up photography myself, and it's a lot of fun.
And do you see any, relationship to your writing, or do you see it as something completely separate?
Well, I took up film photography back in June as a way of like doing something creative because I wasn't able to write. I was really blocked, and it was immediately so nice to have just a different way of seeing the world. And it's been a lot of fun just to learn about photography and to take pictures and to sort of make these things. And I feel like I just got to the phase in my technical development where when I look at the pictures, I feel like I have a similar feeling that I get when I read a great short story, and that they feel charged, like charged with not necessarily even with like a story I'm telling, but they have that sort of sense of charged possibility that I think really great short stories have. And it's been great. It's fed me creatively. And I do find myself thinking about narrative differently because I don't know, it's quite different. You're right. Like they feel very, very different, but they feel like they're in conversation in some way.
And also, I think this is possibly it helps reading or writing because it's so different, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you go spend a bunch of time using a completely different muscle, and perhaps a muscle that you're not even so good at, right? That you're not an expert at, and you're trying it and you get frustrated and you get exhausted, that by the time you go back to writing, you are refreshed. The writing side has been, detoxified in some way. And also sometimes perhaps in the best case scenario, you think, oh, I'm actually a bit better at this than I am at, this like art form that I amateurly practice. Well, this is in my case.
And it's been really weird for me because I feel like when I look at my pictures now, I'm like, oh, this is so much better than all the bad writing I've been doing lately. Like these feel like real things, and like the writing feels really bad in some ways. But I mean, like when I'm out taking pictures, because it's film, I don't know what the outcome is. And so it has like completely decoupled my sense of enjoyment of the art from having a direct readout. And so it has been really nurturing and like healing in that way, because I think sometimes with writing we get in these really dark, damaged pathways of like feedback where we're like judging the outcome immediately, and it gets in the way of the doing. And for me, photography has been really healing in respect to that.
I know exactly what you mean, and like just doing something creatively where you do not have to critique yourself and just allow, whatever outcome to emerge.
Yeah, I get out there and I go out and I shoot in New York City, and I'm gone from my apartment like 3 hours. And by the time it's over, I'm like, oh, I was out shooting pictures for 3 hours. And I was so concerned with the sort of, this, you've got to like get your exposure and do your compositions. I was so in it that I didn't even have time to sort of think about what the outcome would be. I was just concerned with the making, and I thought nothing about my stories or my characters or whatever. I was just creating, and it's like it's been really sustaining and really healing for me, and I really love it. It was the best thing to pick up.
Brandon, bring your camera when you come to Paris.
I will. That's my plan. Maybe one last question. This one's from Jess. I love that we can talk about photography. I don't know any other photographers, so I might just be emailing you annoying questions after this. Are there any other writers who have helped you form your style and voice?
Yes, there are many writers. In the case of this book, I mean, there are sort of my canonical writers who formed my younger reading and writing self. I mean, Orhan Pamuk, Marquez, Alice Munro, Tolstoy, Virginia Woolf. And then there are sort of the patron saints of every book or whatever I'm writing. And for this book, I would say primarily Yuko Tsushima's Territory of Light and Celia Paul's Self-Portrait. These two books really informed White on White. Also, Amina Kane's Indelicacy, and Natalia Ginsburg novels, and a novel by Tove Jansson called The True Deceiver, about an artist who is very manipulative. And there's sort of double story happening, and this idea of reflecting one another.
I love that. I'm gonna steal all of those when I go, and I've read the Celia Paul. It is devastating, and like it. Yeah, what a book.
Yeah, it's an unbelievable book.
Yeah, I love it. I love that. Oh man. I also love the idea of books having patron saints, because I feel the same way about my work. I always have like a list of people who are so important for each little book. I feel like it just helps me set the tone to myself in
Exactly.
some ways.
Yes.
Yeah, so you heard it here, folks. Find your patron saints for your books. It's a great way to set the tone. I think that's it for the questions. I'm so thrilled you let me be in conversation with you. I'm so glad we got to talk about this book and also photography.
I loved it. More photography conversations to come.
I mean,
thank you so much for this conversation.
Of course, thank you. It's been great.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today, and thank you both so much for this conversation. It was so interesting to listen to. And don't forget, you can buy your copy of the book from Books and Books online or in stores if you're in Miami. And please don't forget to support your indie bookstores during this time. It's so important. And thank you both. This has been such a great event.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Books and Books.